Join us on a journey where we unravel the latest trends, tackle your burning questions, and explore innovative strategies that are shaping the future of compensation, all with a cup of coffee in hand. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Comp and Coffee. In today's episode, we are going to be taking a look at PayScale's Gender Pay Gap Report. This report will be released on March the 25th, and it's research that reveals how much women are paid compared to men in the United States, according to PayScale data. And it's unique in the fact that we cover both the data on the controlled and the uncontrolled pay gaps, with data cuts by parent status, job seeking status, remote work status, education age, race, job level, industry, occupation, and location, amongst a few things, as well as top jobs where the gender pay gap is widened. So if you want to understand how pay gaps are playing out, this is the report that you want to get your hands on. For me, it's a really important piece of research because it's established itself as one of the most comprehensive diagnostics of pay inequality in the US workforce over time. And it's that historical view that's really interesting for us to track as we look at developments in labour markets and employment legislation. Our 2026 data shows that the US uncontrolled gender pay gap widened slightly this year from 0.83 cents on the dollar to 0.82. So that gap translates to 14,300 less in median earnings for women annually. And if you play that out over a 40-year career, that difference can add up to over $1 million in lost earnings per woman and more than 1.1 trillion across the US workforce. So these stats matter. The story becomes much more nuanced when we look at data that are controlled. When accounting for or controlling for factors like job title, experience, education, women show in our study that they earn 99 cents on the dollar, and that is the same as last year. So today we're going to unpack all the data in the study, and I've got two great guests, two repeat guests coming with me to dig into what explains the remaining pay gaps and why transparency and pay equity conversations are becoming inseparable. And we're going to be covering many things in today, including why the uncontrolled pay gap has widened, why pay transparency and pay equity now move together, where the gender pay gap is widest in 2026, and how pay inequities compound over careers. So I'm going to start by having our two guests introduce themselves. As I said, they're both repeat guests. Vicky Peakman, welcome back to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience and remind them who you are and what you do?
Hi. Yeah, it's brilliant to be back. Always my favorite people to talk to. I am Vicky Peakman. I am the founder of Fair Pay Partners, which is a consultancy that helps companies with all things pay equity, pay transparency. And I was privileged to work with you two at PayScale.
And you're based in Edinburgh.
Edinburgh. Yeah, but I cover clients all over the world.
Okay. And Lulu, welcome back again. Do you want to reintroduce yourself to the audience?
Hi, everybody. I'm Lulu Seikaly. I am Senior Corporate Employment Counsel here at PayScale. I am so delighted to be back with the two goats of pay equity and pay transparency, Ruth and Vicky. So at PayScale, I advise our people teams on all internal issues regarding employment situations, but I also work very closely with Ruth and her team, and I track and follow all things legislation as it comes to compensation. So whether that's pay equity laws, pay transparency laws, and I am based in Dallas, Texas. That is where I am, but cover everything globally.
Great. Thank you, Lulu. Well, welcome back, Vicky, and welcome back, Lulu. And thanks for helping me unpack the data from our report. Now, it does tell a complicated story, and we do, as I say, report on both the controlled and uncontrolled pay gaps, which I know many people find confusing because the two terms are obviously often conflated. So, Vicky, I'm going to come to you first. Can you start us off by clarifying the difference between those two different pay gaps?
Sure. So the controlled, we'll use that one first because that's the kind of easiest to understand. That's basically looking at the sort of equal pay laws that we have across the world. That's looking at jobs or work that's very similar and whether or not their pay is similar for those jobs that you would expect to be paid the same. So that's at a controlled level. So we're controlling for all the reasons why people are paid differently to get to that equal pay level. Uncontrolled is calculated as the mean or median pay gap for either the country or the organization or however you're looking at it. But it's basically that kind of middle person against each other. And often it's thought of as an opportunity gap rather than like a pay. It is explained by pay, but actually it's showing that sometimes, in particularly in gender pay gap, men have a higher chance and opportunity of being paid at the higher levels. Does that
Yeah,
explain it?
great. That's a great explanation. Thank you. And so we're seeing those two differences. Can you try and explain why the controlled pay gap is so much like smaller or close to that $1 on the dollar than the uncontrolled pay gap?
Yeah, because most organizations, they're not paying, they're not they're going against the law. They want to pay the sort of same. So if you're in the same job, in the same organization, you're likely to be paid similarly to the person next to you. And the same goes across society for the same jobs, because we do see differences, and we might talk about that a bit later. There are some jobs where that there is a bigger difference, but actually if you control for kind of location, it's pretty much the same, because most companies use market data, like the market data from pay scale. So you're sort of all paying around the same for the same jobs. And so at that control level, it's not surprising that it's similar. It is surprising that it's not 1-to-1, right? I mean, you would hope that it would be 1-to-1. That's what we're aiming for. But because of the way stats work, if it's like under 99 or 1.1 or 1, it's around that. And I think that we're happy with that.
Great, thank you. So if you're an organization listening into the podcast, Lulu, why is it important for them to understand both pay gaps?
So Vicky explained both pay gaps perfectly. From a legal perspective, your controlled gap is your legal compliance story. It kind of looks at the question, are we paying people equally for equal work? So this is what statutes like the Federal Equal Pay Act in the US require. But if you only look here, you may think, okay, well, everything is fine. I don't have to do anything further. Like our books are clean. But in the uncontrolled pay gap, that's kind of your reputation and regulatory story. So it's that number that shows up in the EEO1 component 2 data. It's going to show up in your EU Pay Transparency Directive reports, your state pay data filings, and then every headline about your company. So the uncontrolled pay gap answers that question, what does our workforce compensation look like in the aggregate? So a clean controlled gap with a widened uncontrolled pay gap actually signals a big structural problem. So certain groups aren't advancing into higher paying roles, and you absolutely cannot address one without the other. So a company that fixes its control gap but ignores the uncontrolled pay gap, they're gonna get scrutiny from regulators, from candidates, from investors if you're a private company. And then a company that focuses only on the uncontrolled gap may end up throwing money at the wrong problem without fixing the root causes and kind of the job architecture and the promotion pipelines. So because I look at everything from the lens of pay transparency, we have a lot of laws on the US side. And then, of course, we're looking at the EU directive that's going to be coming up here in the next few months. But with these pay transparency laws, especially in places like California and Illinois and Minnesota, and then the EU directive, these requirements are now going to be multiplying audiences, like the eyes of the amount of people who are going to see your pay data. So investors, regulators, candidates, and current employees are all looking at what your pay data looks like. So when those audiences then see the uncontrolled gap and they see it's a huge gap, they're not going to care that your control gap is clean. They see a number, they're going to form a judgment, and that's going to be the next headline and the PR mess that you're going to have to fix. So from a narrative perspective, organizations are going to have to address both. They're going to have to say like, hey, here's what we pay for equal work. Here's what we're doing about representation and access to higher paying roles.
Right, thank you. So we have two pay gaps. Both of them are kind of like we have a legal responsibility to make sure that we should be focusing on them. Lulu, can you talk from the US perspective, like how do legal frameworks shape this conversation around equal pay for equal work?
So pay equity, the laws surrounding pay equity on the US side were built to answer just one big question, like, are you paying men and women equally for the same job? Like, period, the end. That's the control gap. So that's what Vicky, was talking about earlier about the controlled gap. That's the gap that we're still seeing like pennies on a dollar difference. And most organizations are actually really good at that. But the law was never designed to fix like the why piece of it, like why men and women end up in different jobs and different levels in the first place. A company can be fully compliant. No man is paid more than any woman in the same role, but still have a 20% plus uncontrolled pay gap in their organization. And the reason is because women are concentrated in lower paying roles and underrepresented in leadership. So, maybe you don't see a lot of women in the VP and up leadership at your organization, and that's why you have such a big uncontrolled pay gap. The law, unfortunately, says that's okay, but the data is going to end up telling a different story. So the uncontrolled pay gap is driven like things like who gets hired into senior roles? Do you have a process and policy in place behind that at your organization? Who gets promoted? How are they getting promoted? Who has access to higher functions like those roles in engineering or maybe in sales in your organization? So those are structural and cultural issues that equal pay statutes were never intended to address and never designed to address. So maybe that's going to be the next wave. Maybe on the US side, the next few years, we're going to end up seeing lawmakers really tackle that issue down the line on the legal perspective. But at the end of the day, that's the gap that the law hasn't caught up to yet. And that's exactly the gap that transparency legislation that we're seeing on the US side and on the EU side and the directive and public reporting are all now making visible. So now that's kind of why I love the pay transparency legislation, because it's addressing the equal pay laws at a different level.
So, Vicky, in the EU, where we're both based, that's a slightly different story. It goes beyond equal pay for equal work. Do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah. So what's interesting, it's just a tiny wording difference between the legislation in the EU and the legislation in the US. And it talks about equal pay for equal value. So it's equal pay for equal work, or work of equal value is actually the whole phrase, which is a bit weird. I don't know why they say or. But anyway, so the value thing is the really interesting one, because how do you determine whether or not two jobs that are different are of equal value and therefore are able to be compared from an equal law standpoint? And one of the things that's kind of coming up quite a lot with the EU pay transparency is that they're talking about these categories of worker, and that is basically a group of jobs of equal value. And in order to get to that, you're having to look at it from a structural point of view, a job architecture point of view, and often a job evaluation point of view. So basically all jobs in the same kind of grade or level are now being thought of as equal value. And that's been the law since the EU was set up. But actually most companies have really thought about it more from a job point of view, or a job within jobs within the same job family point of view. Actually with the market data that we see, there's actually some quite large differences between different job families. And so suddenly there's this massive spotlight being put on to this phrase equal value. And most companies in the EU are like, I didn't really know what that meant. And so even though it has been law for a while, I think, and obviously in the UK, which is not in the EU, but in the UK we have the same laws, and there's some big law cases going through at the moment about retail workers, front desk retail workers against warehouse workers within the big supermarkets. And obviously we've also had stuff with the councils here, Finman versus cleaners. So there have been kind of cases before, but I think this is sort of shining a light on it across the whole of the EU. And obviously with the EU Pay Transparency Directive, on top of that, we've got the whole uncontrolled pay gaps having to be shown every company above, in the end, 100. And providing transparency to all employees and candidates. So it's a huge thing across Europe at the moment. And I think we're not quite sure where it's going to end, how it's going to end and how people are going to, companies are going to deal with it.
Yeah. So I think, as I look at all the evolving legislation, it's becoming increasingly apparent that understanding both these pay gaps is really important for an organization. We always used to kind of focus on the equal pay for work of equal value, or equal pay for equal work lens, which we, as Lulu, you correctly explained, it was the controlled pay gap. But as underneath the EU Pay Transparency Directive, Californian legislation, we may see that expanding into other states in the US. Also reporting on your uncontrolled pay gaps is going to become increasingly important. So if you're not clear on the definitions, grab the report, read the report. We explain them in there. And hopefully, you'll have a better understanding of what the two pay gaps are, and you can think about how they apply within your organization. Okay, so let's move on. The data also highlights throughout the report where pay gaps appear most clearly. And as I mentioned, a list of different lenses that we look at it. For example, the gender pay gap we know widens as women age and climb the corporate ladder. We also, when we analyze by race, see that it's widest for American Indian and Alaska Native women, And it's also largest in certain occupations, including legal roles. So Lulu, as our resident lawyer, let's talk about that to start off with. The legal profession itself shows one of the widest pay gaps in our data. Why do certain industries or professions struggle more with pay equity?
So I think it comes down to how compensation is ultimately structured and how people advance. So in the traditional law firm world, three things are compounding this problem. So the first one is that promotion pipelines are super long and incredibly subjective. So before I came to PayScale, I was in the law firm world. So I know firsthand how frustrating this can be for lawyers. But making partner at your firm can take somewhere between 8 to 12 years. That's a huge range. And the criteria to make partner is usually very subjective. Who's getting the high profile client? Who gets sponsored by a senior partner? Is your senior partner advocating and going to the table for you? How much business are you bringing in? So here, bias has more room to operate. So the longer and the less transparent the pipeline, the wider that control gap often tends to be. The second thing in the legal world, on the law firm world, is that billable hours. That is, if there are any lawyers listening to this, I'm so sorry for the PTSD I have created for you, but billable hour models do reward availability, not necessarily how efficient you are. So if you're billing the most hours, you're going to be the one to getting ahead. So that structurally actually disadvantages anyone with caregiving responsibilities or boundaries on availability. Like when I was a young lawyer, I remember one of the first things someone told me was, you get into the office before your boss gets in and you leave after your boss leaves. Well, as a young lawyer without a family, maybe you're able to do that, but especially if you're a young man, you're probably able to do that, especially if you don't have a family. So this kind of structure disproportionately affects women. So, and then the compensation model itself creates a sorting mechanism, like who's able to answer their phone on the weekends and bill hours when your partner is calling you, etc. And then the third thing, and I think this can be applicable to a lot of other professions, is negotiations, and especially in the legal world, really play a huge role here. So in professions where organization credits your book of business or individual deal making, that's going to drive your compensation, and that's ultimately going to widen your gap because research consistently shows that men negotiate more aggressively and are rewarded for it, while women actually face social penalties for the same behavior. So when your pay system, especially in the law firm world, can rely heavily on individual negotiation rather than a standardized structure, you're building inequity into the model. So like I mentioned, this is really typical for the law firm world, but you also see it in consulting, you see it in finance, anywhere where compensation is tied to long subjective pipelines, availability-based models, or individual negotiation. But industries that have more standardized pay structures, like a unionized workforce, government agencies, we see that in education, they tend to have narrower gaps, which tells you the problem is systemic design, not necessarily individual performance.
Right, thank you. And so, as well as between different industries and roles, one of the patterns we see in our data is that the gap widens for women as they progress in their careers. We analyze in some depth the impact of the motherhood penalty in our data. Vicky, can you talk us through why that phenomenon happens, what's causing it, what's not solving for that problem?
Yeah, I remember when I first looked at this and I was like, oh, like maybe it's that, women who started their careers, 30 years ago, they had a big pay gap when they started, and then it's carried through. And then as the younger generations come through, that pay gap will be continue to sort of be, because it's smaller when they, right? This was my first thought. Like, let's have a look at the data, because the UK ONS produces loads of there's census data in the US produce it. And there is some argument to that, like the generation of, the 20s, sort of 10 years ago, their pay gap will not be as big as the people who are currently in their 50s, but it will be bigger than it is when they started work. And that's the problem, right? So why is that? So it might not be as big, as definitely an issue over time. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is to do with not progressing in your career in the same speed as your male counterparts. So we do see that firstly, there's the whole motherhood penalty. If you take any kind of time out at all, then when you come back in again, you often come back in sometimes lower than you were before, or at least at the same level as you were. So therefore, you're taking longer to get further up your career, so that as you're older, you're earlier on, if that makes sense. But even if you don't have children, or you do stay in work even though you have children, the time to promotion for women is longer than the time for, and it's exactly what you were just talking about, Lulu, in terms of law firm, but we see it across everywhere. So is that because women don't put themselves up for promotion at the same rate as men? Potentially, there's a lot about kind of, if you have structures in place that why people get promotions, like they don't have to put themselves forward for it. Women get promoted quicker than if they have to put themselves forward for it, for example. So there are reasons why that happens, but it does tend to be the case that women, even in the same situations as men, take longer to get more senior in the organization. And we know it's a funnel, so there are fewer jobs at that kind of VP and above level, and then so people are going to lose out, and it seems like there's more women who lose out as a percentage than men. So there's that whole aspect of it. And then, just generally from an uncontrolled point of view, like why women just aren't in those roles that are high paid. And there's huge sort of societal structural reasons for that we all know of, some of which are caring responsibilities. But it's not just caring for children, like motherhood penalty we talk about a lot, but actually there's this massive caring for parents now kind of issue coming in. And particularly there's the new phrase, the sandwich generation. The older you are to have children, more likely you are to have children and parents to care for at the same time. And so loads of people are actually having to take time off work because they don't have the time to do the work, or they end up doing work that is part-time or lower paid in order to be able to kind of cope with all the different things that are going on for them. So there's quite a lot there.
Great, thank you. So you've both kind of covered lots of the different reasons about why we see this perpetuating uncontrolled pay gap, both across society and in different industries and workplaces. I think it's going to be increasingly important for you to understand what's creating that within your own organisation, because we know, for example, Vicky, under the EU Pay Transparency Directive, if you have an uncontrolled pay gap greater than 5%, then you're going to have investigation into that. And then also in the UK, there's new laws coming under the Employment Rights Bill. Are you going to keep me honest here? Where up until now, we've been busy reporting on gender pay gaps in the UK since 2017, but we've not had to publicly disclose any action plan that we're doing to close those gaps, whereas that is now going to change also.
Yeah, and actually, so in the EU, just to confirm, that 5% pay gap where you're going to have to do further analysis, that is at a category level, not at the whole company level. So there's still nothing kind of to stop you having a massive pay gap at the company level, except the whole reputational risk issue. But if you have within that kind of group of jobs of equal value a bigger than 5% pay gap, then yes, you have to be able to, that's not justifiable, then you have to be able to explain it and do more analysis. In the UK, the interesting thing, we're just talking about people struggling to kind of cope, like in a society which was set up by men, designed by men, structurally kind of for men, women are trying to fit into that, and that's great from an economic point of view. But we do have the situation where unless there's equal caring responsibilities between men and women, then you've got the women who have got the caring responsibilities plus the work, and actually are really struggling to kind of make that work, particularly at the levels that we're talking about. We're talking about how do we have women in senior leadership? How do you do women in senior leadership who have also got children and parents that they're going? So in the UK, we've got this new thing of the action plans coming in, which is great. So unfortunately, they're not requiring you to actually fix anything. They're just requiring you to say that you've got an action plan, but like it is a little bit further. And part of that is a menopause action plan, which is interesting. So it's kind of, again, kind of thinking like what all those different reasons why women are struggling to kind of stay in work at the older, above 40 age group. Like actually, how do we make sure that we do keep women as part of the economy? Because unfortunately, we don't have, caring responsibilities are often unpaid, and therefore they're not part of the whole, economy, which is okay.
Yeah, great. So yeah, lots to unpack. I mean, we could probably talk for a long time about all the different lenses of the pay gap, as I said, that are in the report. Probably do like 3 episodes on that. But I did want to talk about this relationship between pay gaps, pay equity, and pay transparency. I feel we can't talk about pay equity and pay gaps without talking about pay transparency at the same time. They're definitely cousins, if not sisters, I would say. And for me, transparency tells people what you pay. Equity tells people what you value. That's how kind of like one way I like to think of it. And you can't have one without the other. Yeah, I'll say that again, shall I? Transparency tells people what you pay, but equity tells people what you value. And that
sounds like a new
really
LinkedIn
important
post for Ruth.
Yeah,
Ruth, she says a LinkedIn post.
Definitely going to be a video about that coming out soon.
Clip it.
But clip it. I will. We also know that laws are changing how organizations approach compensation. So in the US, we have 15 states with pay transparency legislation, I think, at last count. Interestingly, in the report, our data shows that 9 of those states have already closed the controlled gender pay gap. I thought that was an interesting correlation this year. Maybe it's showing that the laws are having the impact that we want. But it's definitely, pay transparency legislation is becoming much more of a catalyst for equitable pay practices. Lulu, how is the growing wave of pay transparency legislation changing the legal landscape for employers? Again, you could probably do a whole episode on that, but
I could probably do an entire episode on it. But I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, the first piece is that the volume and pace are unprecedented on the US side, at least. And then once the EU directive fully gets into force, that's an additional 27 member states that are going to have requirements, and then probably the UK following shortly thereafter. And then maybe we'll see some movement in, I know New Zealand and Australia have been doing some work as well there. So, I mean, I think it's going to end up being a huge wave. On the US side specifically, those compliance obligations are actually getting much more specific. It's no longer, hey, just post a range. In January of this year, California enacted a new bill. It's SB 642. And now you have to put in California a good faith estimate on what you pay at hire. So that's specifically to prevent employers from posting these like insanely large, broad ranges. And now we're also seeing states enforcing heavily, like New Jersey and Illinois have already begun enforcement actions. Colorado's, which was the very first OG state to put pay transparency in job postings in force, has also imposed some significant fines. Washington State, there have been a lot of class actions there, a lot of organizations settling class actions regarding not complying with pay transparency laws. And then pay range disclosures, like when we're talking about pay transparency and organizations posting their ranges for the world to see, it's kind of changing the power dynamic a little bit. So when candidates and employees can see like what their organization is looking to pay their current role in a job posting, that compensation negotiation becomes like an incredibly different conversation. At that point, employees can start benchmarking their own roles in real time by just pulling up LinkedIn and seeing what their organizations are posting for their same roles. That's really good for equity, but it means organizations do need to have a defensible compensation philosophy before posting that range. So that's what I always talk about. You have to get your house in order. You can't just throw a dart at the board and pick a range to post on a job posting. You need to have thoughtful processes behind the scenes to make sure that you can explain if somebody comes to you and says like, hey, you're posting this range that's 20% more than what I'm making. Why am I at the very pit of the bottom of this range? You have to have good explanations for that. And kind of like in that same vein, employees now are kind of the audience for what you're doing on the pay transparency side. It's not just candidates looking at your job postings. So the laws aren't just affecting recruiting, but there are now laws kind of coming into force on the US side requiring organizations to provide incumbent employees their own salary range at least once a year or if they ask for it. So, this kind of ties back to that whole controlled, uncontrolled pay gap conversation we had at the top of the episode, which is, transparency is making that data visible to audiences who are going to ask the hard questions. And if your posted ranges are consistent, but your workforce composition shows women clustered at the bottom of those ranges or women not in those leadership positions where they can get paid more, transparency isn't going to solve the problem. It's actually just going to highlight it.
Yeah. And obviously, pay equity analysis is part of this story, Vicky, and I know that's something you work with clients on. Why do we need to do pay equity analysis to support pay transparency?
In the end, I kind of dream of a world where we don't have to do pay equity analysis anymore. Obviously, that's potentially a little way off, but the whole point of it to do the analysis is to see whether there are problems, right? And one of the reasons for that was being that companies have not had structures set up in order to understand exactly why people are paid as they are. So you pay people, managers make decisions, you benchmark differently throughout the year, you kind of make all these ad hoc decisions, you give people bonuses whenever they need to, and then at the end of the year you do an analysis to see whether or not you've kind of mucked up a bit anywhere along the way, right? That's where we used to do, and also just to check that we don't have any sort of things that are breaking the law, right? That's the reason used to be the reason for pay equity analysis. Like now, it's more than that. Firstly, we need to do it now to make sure that haven't got those people who are being paid less than they should be if we're providing the information out to the world as to what that job should be paid. If there's people being paid under that, that's to risk from an employee point of view, retention point of view, but also in the end, particularly with the EU Pay Transparency Directive, it's not just about saying, look, we're not paying like illegally, which, probably shouldn't have to say out loud. You should probably just not break, but like that controlled level is basically, hey, everyone, we're legally compliant, right? So that's great. But some of these, the whole point of this is not just to say, but is to say to that employee, look, you may be, if you've got that group of all of those different jobs and all of the different reasons why, which is justifiable for people paying differently within that. Maybe they've got more experience, maybe they have to have a special skill, maybe their performance is higher, all these reasons for paying differently within it. If you have someone who's paid low in that range, you want to be able to say to them, this is why you're paid as you are, and you want them to believe you and trust that you are being paid. That employee has to basically trust that the company is paying them fairly against their own pay philosophy, and that they've got to trust that they're paying everyone else fairly against that philosophy. So in order to do that, firstly, you have to have a philosophy and the structures around it, and then you have to be able to actually prove that you can pay. So the directive is basically tell everyone how you pay and then show that you pay that way. That's really all it's doing. And so what's really exciting about the pay transparency is if you have all that in place and everyone is being paid fairly, it's not so much about annually doing a pay equity analysis. It's about checking all the time that you're not, and that actually that analysis at the end is really just a tick box exercise, because you don't need to be checking because you're not making those mistakes as you're going on. So that's where I sort of see it evolving really from sort of pay equity, but it's still really at this exact moment really important, because a lot of companies don't have any idea why their pay gaps are what they are.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've spent a lot of time so far. We've been talking about the different pay gaps, how they show up. We've also been very much focused on this as like a compliance requirement, because obviously it is. We've also talked about it being like a social responsibility issue. I want to close out. You both mentioned this word trust, and that's kind of like equally important for me, is the fact that being able to, or paying people equitably and being transparent about pay is really important, because it does foster stronger employee trust, which ultimately can lead to better retention and more sustainable compensation strategies. Vicky, as organizations approach pay equity, if they only approach it as a compliance exercise, what changes should leaders do in order to treat this more as part of their compensation strategy, like built into their comp strategy?
Yeah, I have companies, talking to me about this all the time, and they come with it as a compliance issue. And then that obviously makes sense. You've heard that there's this thing coming down the road. There's going to be all this reporting. It's all about numbers. It's all about pay. And I basically say, it's a communication issue. This is all about communication. Because if you just do it as a compliance exercise, then you think of it as like an internal part of your work, right? We need to produce this report for this organization, and you can do that internally. You don't have to, but that's not what it is, because it's the word is transparency. So actually, whatever you report is going to go out, and we haven't talked about it, but the massive kicker is not only can people ask for employees can ask for their pay rate, their pay information, but they also can ask for the average for men and women in their category of work. So it's like huge. Like why am I paid less than the woman who's paid less than the man in my group of work? To be able to answer that question isn't about reporting. It isn't about compliance. It isn't about the numbers. It's about, why do you pay people what you're paying people? And often companies don't have the answer for that. And so you need to be thinking about, okay, let's put a line in the sand now. how do we, if we were starting from scratch, how would we want to pay? How are we going to make sure that we are doing this for all the newcomers, all of the people who are coming in, all from future, this is how we'll pay. And then try to work out how do we get all the people who've maybe not been paid that way into that kind of structure. And so companies are really having to reorganize how they do compensation. But again, if you just think about it for compliance, you're going to miss like the fact that this is a huge communication exercise for your employees and for your candidates, because there'll be a lot of companies who are paying less than their competitors. And so it's not just about this is what we're going to pay you as a range. It's about that context around it. What are our benefits? What kind of company are we? You know, how kind of friendly are we? Like, why are we doing a good job? Like, why do you want to come and work for us? So it's all about communication in the end.
And Lulu, like, you've talked about this a lot, like what's the risk for an organization if they just treat pay equity as a reactive legal issue versus something more proactive?
I can spend a whole hour on this, but I will very quickly put it into three just big buckets, which is, of course, from a legal perspective, there's litigation risk if you're not complying. I think the next two are actually the bigger ones and probably more costly, which is your reputational risk as an organization for not complying, and then eroding employee trust. And it's not just eroding candidates, like a trust from the candidates who are applying to your organization, but your internal, your incumbent, and likely your high performers. You're eroding those trusts and those attrition numbers are going to go up.
Right, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to put you on the spot. We're going to close out. One thing, Vicky, that you would recommend organizations do to help address both like pay transparency and pay equity?
Write out how and why you pay people what you pay people. Write it in a document, and then you'll find out what you do know
Yes.
and what you don't know.
Yeah, and then test it to see whether it actually applies within your organization. It's such an important part of this story, particularly even like if you think under the EU PTD or the EU Pay Transparency Directive, that is one of the
Right.
rights that employees will have, is to say
Yes, is to read the information.
Yeah.
Yeah. But think about it from both angles, uncontrolled and controlled. Like, how do we pay? How do we progress?
And Lulu?
Yeah, I would say at the beginning of the episode, I mentioned that pay transparency laws are tools intended to help close the gender pay gaps and to really help pay equity. So I would say use pay transparency to build trust rather than fear. And especially if you're an organization that operates in a state that doesn't require pay transparency, to do that, you're going to really see the employee morale go up, your candidate quality go up, your time to hire shorten. So that would be my one big thing.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for helping to take a look at PayScale's gender pay gap report in this episode. I think the question that was billed for this episode is, is pay equity still a priority? I think everything that we've discussed today has underlined that, yes, it very much is. So thank you, Vicky Peakman and Lulu Seikaly, for joining the conversation today. Really appreciate you both giving your time. And if you want to explore the data behind this discussion, then you can download the 2026 Gender Pay Gap report. That will be linked in the show notes. And as always, we'd love to hear from you. If there's any comments that you've got on this episode or anything you would like us to discuss on a future episode, then please email us at coffee@payscale.com or join the conversation on LinkedIn, where we will be sharing some of the insights from this episode today in the near future. So thank you again, Vicky, and thank you again, Lulu, and thank you all for listening.